Arizona, 1945. The transport trucks rumbled through desert heat that bent the horizon into waves, carrying 43 German women who had been told what awaited them. They sat rigid in the metal beds, hands folded across laps, eyes fixed on nothing. Each had heard the stories, what conquering soldiers did to captured women, what the Russians had done in Berlin, what they themselves had been warned Americans would do. The truck slowed at the gate of Camp Florence, and Greta Weber felt her stomach turn to ice. Then the guards stepped back and looked away. The war had ended 3 months earlier, but for these women, captivity stretched backward into a different lifetime. Most had served in auxiliary roles, clerks, nurses, radio operators, attached to Wehrmacht units across occupied Europe. When Germany collapsed, they had scattered like leaves in a storm, some fleeing west toward American lines, others captured as Soviet forces swept across the Reich. The ones who reached American custody counted themselves fortunate. The ones who didn't rarely survived to tell what happened. The women arriving at Camp Florence in July 1945 represented a peculiar category in the vast machinery of post-war detention. They were not Nazis, not war criminals, not even soldiers in the strictest sense. They were functionaries, caught in the gears of a collapsing regime, and the American military struggled with what to do with them. Male POWs filled camps across the American Southwest, cooking, farming, building roads. But women? The precedent was thin, the protocols uncertain. Greta Weber had turned 24 the week before surrender. She had worked as a radio operator in occupied France, translating intercepted signals, cataloging frequencies, her hands moving across dials and keys with mechanical precision. When the Americans came, her unit scattered. She hid for 6 days in a barn outside Reims before hunger drove her into the open. The GIs who found her were younger than she expected, chewing gum, rifles slung casual across shoulders. They searched her for weapons, found none, and loaded her onto a truck with 11 other women. No one touched her. No one even tried. The journey west had taken weeks, from France to England by ship, packed below decks with hundreds of other prisoners. Then across the Atlantic in convoy, the ocean gray and endless, the cramped quarters reeking of diesel and unwashed bodies. Greta kept to herself, speaking little, watching everything. The American guards changed shifts every 8 hours. They brought food that was better than anything she had eaten in 2 years. They called her ma'am. She waited for the other shoe to drop. It never did. Camp Florence sat in the Sonoran Desert 40 miles north of Tucson, a sprawl of tar paper barracks and Quonset huts, surrounded by double fences and watchtowers that cast long shadows across packed earth. The camp had been built for German and Italian men, captured in North Africa and Sicily, thousands of them rotating through work details on nearby farms and railroads. By 1945, most had been repatriated. The women's compound occupied the southeast corner, separate from the remaining male prisoners, a dozen buildings clustered around a dusty parade ground where nothing ever paraded. The heat was biblical. It pressed down like a physical weight, turning the air thick and difficult to breathe. Greta stepped from the truck into sunlight that felt like standing too close to a furnace. The other women followed, blinking, uncertain, forming a loose group near the gate. American soldiers watched from the shade of the guard tower, faces hidden beneath helmet brims. None approached. A woman emerged from the nearest barracks, older, American, wearing a Red Cross armband and a dress that looked impossibly clean. Her name was Margaret Sullivan, and she had volunteered for this assignment because no one else wanted it. She spoke some German, learned from her grandmother in Pennsylvania, and she used it now. Welcome to Camp Florence. You will be housed in barracks 7 through 9. Mess hall is there, she pointed. Showers are behind building 12. Roll call twice daily, morning and evening. Work assignments begin Monday. Questions? The German women stared. No one spoke. Margaret Sullivan nodded once as if she had expected this. Follow me. The barracks were clean. That was the first shock. Rows of metal cots, each with folded blankets and a pillow. Windows with screens. A concrete floor swept free of dust. light fixtures that worked. It looked nothing like the photographs from Bergen-Belsen that had been circulating through Allied newspapers. Nothing like the conditions Greta had heard described in whispered conversations among refugees fleeing east. She chose a cot near the back, away from the door, and sat. The metal frame creaked. Through the window she could see the guard tower, the fence, the desert stretching away toward mountains that shimmered in the heat. A woman named Ilse, who had been a clerk in Normandy, took the cot beside her. "It's a trick," Ilse whispered. "They are making us comfortable before." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. That night, Greta lay awake listening to the other women breathe in the darkness. Some cried quietly. Others simply stared at the ceiling, counting hours. She thought about the propaganda they had all absorbed, the stories told in every Wehrmacht mess hall and auxiliary unit. Americans were brutes barely civilized, their armies filled with criminals and degenerates who raped their way across Europe. She had half believed it then. She didn't know what to believe now. Morning came with a bell. The women assembled outside, 43 shadows in the gray dawn light, while an American officer read from a clipboard. His name was Captain James Morrison, and he looked tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. He had been running this camp for 11 months, managing captured Germans who spoke little English, and American guards who spoke no German, and the introduction of female prisoners had created complications no manual addressed. Work assignments, Morrison said through an interpreter. Kitchen duty, laundry, grounds maintenance, 8-hour shifts, rotating schedule. You will receive pay in scrip redeemable at the commissary. Questions? Again, silence. Morrison sighed. Dismissed. The first week passed in a fog of routine. Greta was assigned to the laundry, hauling canvas bags of uniforms and linens, feeding them into industrial washers that rumbled like thunder, hanging wet fabric on lines that stretched across the compound. The work was hard but not brutal. The guards watched but did not approach. Meals appeared 3 times daily: oatmeal and toast for breakfast, sandwiches at lunch, stew or beans for dinner, quantities that left Greta feeling uncomfortably full. She had grown accustomed to hunger. The American guards remained distant, almost studiously so. They would nod greeting if a woman passed within 10 feet. They would hold doors open. But they never initiated conversation, never stared, never touched. It was the opposite of what Greta had been told to expect, and the cognitive dissonance left her feeling unmoored. Ilse voiced what many were thinking. Perhaps they find us repulsive. Perhaps they think we are contaminated. But that explanation didn't fit either. The guards were polite, even courteous. When a woman slipped on wet concrete near the showers, a young private named Collins rushed over to help her up, then immediately stepped back, hands raised, apologizing for the contact. The woman, Margaret, who had been a nurse in Brussels, stood there bewildered, rubbing her elbow, watching Collins retreat. "He said sorry," Margaret told the others that evening. "He touched my arm to keep me from falling, and he said sorry." The propaganda began to crack like old paint. 3 weeks into their detention, a woman named Hannah asked Margaret Sullivan why the Americans were treating them this way. Hannah had been a secretary in Hamburg, captured when British forces entered the city. She was 22, and had spent the previous 6 months terrified of what would happen when the Allies found her. Margaret Sullivan considered the question carefully. She was 53 years old, widowed, her son killed at Normandy. She had volunteered for Red Cross duty because sitting home in Pennsylvania felt like suffocating. She had no illusions about war, about what men did to women when discipline broke down. But she also understood something the German prisoners didn't. "American soldiers are court-martialed for that behavior," she said in careful German. "The punishment is severe: prison, dishonorable discharge, sometimes execution. The command takes it seriously." Hannah frowned. "But we are enemies. You are prisoners. There are rules. The Russians—" "I cannot speak to the Russians," Margaret Sullivan interrupted. "I can only tell you what the regulations say here. Any soldier who touches a prisoner inappropriately faces charges. Any soldier. The officers enforce this absolutely." That conversation spread through the barracks like ripples in still water. The women discussed it in whispered tones after lights out, testing the proposition against everything they had been taught. Some remained skeptical. Others felt the first tentative stirrings of something they had not expected to feel again: safety. August came, and with it heat that made the earlier weeks seem temperate. The temperature climbed past 110 degrees most afternoons, turning the compound into a furnace. Work schedules shifted to early morning and late evening, avoiding the worst hours. The women adapted, moving slower, drinking more water, learning to navigate the rhythms of desert survival. Greta found herself working alongside an American corporal named Davies during evening laundry shifts. He was from Montana, 25 years old, and he had spent the war in logistics rather than combat. He spoke no German, she spoke minimal English, but gradually they developed a vocabulary of gestures and simple phrases. He would point at a washing machine. She would nod. She would indicate a heavy basket. He would help her lift it. One evening, as they hung sheets in the fading light, Davies produced a chocolate bar from his pocket. He held it out, not quite looking at her. "For you," he said. "Trade?" Greta stared at the chocolate. She had not tasted anything sweet in over a year. She reached for it slowly, half expecting him to pull it back, to make it a joke. He didn't. He just set it in her hand and returned to work. That night she shared the chocolate with Ilsa and Hannah. They broke it into tiny pieces, letting each square melt slowly on their tongues, and nobody spoke. The taste was overwhelming, rich, sweet, impossibly luxurious. When it was gone, Ilsa started crying. Not from sadness, from confusion. "I do not understand them," she whispered. "I do not understand anything anymore." The psychological transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible, like ice melting in spring. The German women began to relax incrementally, their shoulders loosening, their expressions shifting from constant vigilance to something approaching normalcy. They started conversations among themselves without constantly monitoring the guards. They laughed occasionally. Small things, but significant. Captain Morrison noticed. He mentioned it in his weekly report to the district command. Female prisoners adapting well to camp routine. No disciplinary incidents. Guards maintaining appropriate professional distance per standing orders. What he didn't write, what would have been impossible to quantify in a military report, was the strange alchemy occurring in Camp Florence that summer. The propaganda these women had absorbed, that Americans were barbarous, that captured women would be brutalized, was dissolving in the face of relentless, mundane professionalism. The guards treated them like any other prisoners, with detachment, correctness, and occasionally bored indifference. And precisely that indifference was revolutionary. A woman named Elsa, who had worked in a signals unit in Italy, put it into words during an evening conversation on the barracks steps. "They do not see us as women," she said. "They see us as prisoners. Just prisoners. Nothing else matters to them." Hannah shook her head. "No, they see us as women. They have rules and they follow them." "Why?" Hannah had no answer. None of them did. The concept of institutional discipline overriding individual impulse was foreign to their experience. The Wehrmacht had its regulations, yes, but enforcement was inconsistent, and occupied territories operated under different codes. The idea that American soldiers would rigidly adhere to prisoner treatment protocols, even when those prisoners were enemy women, even when no superior officers were watching, it defied everything they thought they understood about human nature and war. In September, the camp received new orders. The female prisoners would be integrated into the work program more fully, assigned to local farms that needed harvest labor. The arrangement was voluntary. Any woman who preferred to remain in camp could do so, but participation would be noted favorably in repatriation evaluations. 37 women volunteered. Greta was among them. The farm where she was assigned sat 15 miles east of camp, a sprawling cotton operation run by a man named Harold Patterson and his wife June. They were in their 50s, weathered by years of desert agriculture, and they needed help bringing in the harvest. The Army had been sending them male POWs for 2 seasons. Female prisoners were new, but labor was labor. The first morning, a truck delivered Greta and 5 other women to the farm at dawn. Harold Patterson was waiting by the barn, hat pushed back on his head, hands on hips. He looked them over without expression. "You folks know cotton," the interpreter translated. The women shook their heads. "Right, come on then, I'll show you." They followed him into the fields, where rows of cotton plants stretched toward the horizon, white bowls bursting from dried husks. Patterson demonstrated the proper technique. Grasp the bowl firmly, twist and pull, drop it in the sack. Simple motions, endlessly repeated. The women spread out along the rows and began working. The sun climbed higher. Heat shimmered off the earth like water. Greta's hands grew raw, her back aching from the constant bending. But the rhythm was almost meditative, and the work was better than sitting in camp with nothing to do but think. Around mid-morning, June Patterson appeared with a pitcher of lemonade and paper cups. She poured drinks for each woman, smiling, saying nothing. The women accepted the cups carefully, uncertain, and drank. The lemonade was cold, tart, and sweet, and it tasted like something from a dream. September became October. The cotton harvest continued, and the women working Patterson's farm settled into the routine. They arrived at dawn, worked until mid-afternoon when the heat became unbearable, then returned to camp. Harold and June Patterson treated them exactly as they treated the male POWs who had worked previous seasons, with practical courtesy and no particular interest in their personal histories. One afternoon, as they prepared to load the truck for the return journey, June approached Greta with a cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside were sandwiches, still warm, and 2 apples. "For the ride back," June said through the interpreter. "Road's long, and dinner at camp isn't until 6. Greta accepted the bundle, momentarily speechless. June Patterson was already walking away, heading back toward the house, and Greta watched her go. That evening she shared the sandwiches with the other women from the farm detail. The bread was fresh, the meat thick sliced, and they ate slowly, savoring each bite. "She did not have to do that," Ilse said. "No," Greta agreed. "She did not." The question hung unspoken. Then why did she? The answer, though none of them could articulate it yet, lay in the fundamental cultural difference they were encountering. American treatment of prisoners was codified, systematized, and enforced through a military justice system that took violations seriously. But beyond the regulations, there existed a broader cultural expectation that civilized nations treated captives humanely, that women in particular deserved protection regardless of nationality, and that individual soldiers represented their country through their conduct. These were not universal values. The German women knew that intimately. They had seen what happened in occupied territories when discipline broke down, had heard the whispered stories of atrocities committed by Wehrmacht units, by SS divisions, by collaborators of every stripe. They had been taught that such behavior was an unfortunate but inevitable aspect of war, that when men held power over the conquered, certain outcomes were natural. The American refusal to conform to that expectation was disorienting. It suggested that the propaganda had been wrong. And if the propaganda had been wrong about this, what else might it have been wrong about? The question was dangerous, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. A woman named Frida, who had been particularly vocal about her skepticism of American intentions, began writing letters home to her family in Bavaria. The letters were censored, of course, read by camp officials before being forwarded through Red Cross channels. But the censors let most of it through, because Frida wrote nothing classified or strategic. She wrote about the food, the heat, the work assignments, and she wrote about the guards. "They do not touch us," she wrote in October. "I know this must be difficult to believe. I did not believe it myself for many weeks. But it is true. They keep their distance always. Even when it would be natural to, when helping with heavy loads, when passing in narrow spaces, they are careful never to make contact. It is as if we are made of glass and they fear breaking us. I do not know what to make of this. I was told Americans were savages. I was told what would happen to women taken prisoner. None of it was true. I do not know what this means for everything else we were told." The letter reached her family in November. Her mother read it 3 times, then burned it in the stove, afraid of what the occupying forces might think if they found such words in her house. November brought cooler weather and news from Europe. The Nuremberg trials were beginning, prosecuting major Nazi leaders for war crimes. The camp received newspapers, and the German women read accounts of testimony, of evidence presented, of atrocities documented in excruciating detail. Some refused to believe it. Others went silent, processing information that contradicted everything they had been told about the righteousness of the war. Greta found herself thinking about the radio signals she had processed during her service. Orders transmitted, troop movements coordinated, logistical details managed. She had never thought about what those orders meant on the ground, what they looked like when implemented. She had been a cog in a machine, and the machine had been built for terrible purposes. She was not alone in this realization. The barracks conversations that autumn carried a weight they had not held before. The women were beginning to understand that they had served a regime whose crimes extended far beyond conventional warfare, that the Allies had not been lying when they described concentration camps and mass executions and deliberate extermination policies. And if that was true, then everything else, everything they had been taught about enemy brutality and Allied barbarism, had to be reconsidered. The psychological impact was profound. Some women withdrew into denial. Others experienced something like a religious conversion, rejecting everything they had previously believed. Most existed somewhere between, struggling to reconcile the propaganda with reality, trying to understand how they had been so thoroughly deceived. Through it all, the American Guards maintained their professional distance. They brought mail from home. They supervised work details. They conducted inspections and roll calls. They did not exploit, did not abuse, did not even flirt. Their behavior was so consistently, boringly appropriate that it eventually stopped seeming remarkable. That was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect. The women stopped thinking of the Guards as threats and started thinking of them as just guards, men doing a job, following orders, counting days until they could go home. The fear that had colored everything for the first months gradually faded, replaced by a kind of institutional routine that felt almost normal. Captain Morrison wrote in his December report, "Female prisoner morale continues stable. No incidents of misconduct by guards or prisoners. Work program integration successful. Recommend continued current protocols." What the report couldn't capture was the transformation that had occurred. 43 women had arrived at Camp Florence expecting the worst of human nature. They had been prepared for violence, exploitation, brutality. Instead, they had encountered bureaucratic efficiency and rigid professionalism. The cognitive dissonance had forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about Americans, about war, about propaganda and truth. December brought news of impending repatriation. Germany was being divided into occupation zones, and prisoners were being processed for return in categories determined by their service records and security assessments. The women at Camp Florence fell into low-priority classifications: functionaries, clerks, auxiliaries with no connection to war crimes or Nazi Party membership. They would likely be repatriated by spring. The reaction was mixed. Some women were eager to return, desperate to find family members and rebuild lives. Others were reluctant, uncertain what awaited them in a destroyed country under Allied occupation. Greta fell into the latter category. Her family home in Cologne had been bombed in 1944. Her parents were dead. Her brother was missing, last seen on the Eastern Front. She had nothing to return to except rubble and memories. On Christmas Eve, the American Guards distributed Red Cross packages. Tins of cookies, chocolates, cigarettes, small toiletry items. Margaret Sullivan organized a carol service in the mess hall, and some of the women attended, singing in German while the guards stood at respectful distances. The hymns were the same ones they had sung in churches across Germany, before the war, before everything had changed. Greta sat in the back, not singing, listening to voices rise toward the rafters. The tune was Stille Nacht, familiar from childhood, and she felt tears she had not permitted herself to shed for months finally breaking through. Not from sadness exactly, from release, from the exhaustion of being afraid for so long and then discovering the fear had been unnecessary. January 1946 brought final processing. The women underwent medical examinations, paperwork reviews, security interviews. Most would leave by February, transferred to staging areas for transport back to Europe. Greta was among the last group scheduled for repatriation. Her final work assignment was at Patterson's farm, helping with equipment maintenance during the off-season. On her last day, Harold Patterson approached with an envelope. "Wages," he said through the interpreter. "You earned them." Greta opened the envelope. Inside was $65 in American currency, payment for 3 months of harvest work at rates established by the War Department. It was more money than she had seen in years. "We appreciate the help," Patterson continued. "You did good work. You tell folks back home Americans aren't all bad here?" Greta nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Patterson tipped his hat and walked away. The transport trucks left Camp Florence on February 12, 1946. 43 German women climbed aboard, carrying their few possessions in canvas bags, heading back toward a country that no longer existed in the form they remembered. The guards at the gate saluted as the convoy passed through. A perfunctory gesture, nothing more. But several women returned the salute instinctively. Greta watched the camp disappear through the truck's rear opening, the barracks and guard towers shrinking against the desert landscape. She thought about the propaganda she had believed, the fear she had carried, the gradual dissolution of both under the weight of sustained, tedious professionalism. The Americans had not been heroes. They had simply been correct. They had followed their regulations, maintained their discipline, and treated prisoners as the regulations required. It should not have been revolutionary. It was. The experience of German female prisoners in American custody during and after World War II remains one of the lesser-known aspects of the war's conclusion. While male POWs numbered in the hundreds of thousands, working on American farms, building roads, filling labor shortages across the Southwest, female prisoners existed in a category military planners had barely considered. Official records indicate approximately 400,000 German POWs were held in camps across the United States during the war. The vast majority were men captured in North Africa, Italy, and France. Female prisoners numbered fewer than 500, most captured in the final months of the war, when Wehrmacht auxiliary units collapsed alongside regular military formations. American treatment of these prisoners was governed by the Geneva Conventions, which the United States had ratified and took seriously. Violations were punishable under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Courts-martial for misconduct toward prisoners were not uncommon, and penalties were severe. This institutional framework created a system where individual soldiers understood that professional conduct was not optional. It was enforced. The contrast with other theaters was stark. Soviet forces, advancing from the east, operated under different principles. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of German women were assaulted by Red Army soldiers during the conquest of Germany. The distinction was not about individual morality, but about institutional accountability. The American military had structures in place to prevent and punish misconduct. The Red Army did not. For German women captured by Americans, this difference was existential. Their expectations, shaped by propaganda and reports from the Eastern Front, proved entirely wrong. The cognitive dissonance forced many to reconsider the propaganda they had absorbed about Allied forces, about the war itself, and about the regime they had served. The women who passed through camps like Florence carried their experiences back to Germany, where they became living contradictions to the propaganda that had saturated Nazi society. Their stories of professional treatment, adequate food, respectful guards, spread through displaced person camps and rebuilding communities. The stories were often disbelieved initially, too different from what people expected to hear. But as more prisoners returned, as more accounts accumulated, a broader realization emerged. The Allies, particularly the Americans, had conducted themselves differently than the Wehrmacht, differently than the SS, differently than what German citizens had been told to expect. This realization became one of the subtle but powerful forces driving post-war German society toward democracy and Western alignment. Greta Weber eventually settled in Frankfurt, working as a translator for the American occupation authorities. Her English, learned piecemeal in Camp Florence, proved valuable as Germany rebuilt. She married in 1951, had 3 children, and lived until 1998. In an interview conducted in the 1980s for a German historical society, she described her time as a prisoner. "I expected to be treated as spoils of war," she said. "Instead, I was treated as a human being who happened to be on the wrong side. That distinction saved me. More than that, it changed me. I went into that camp believing what I had been told about Americans. I left knowing it was lies. Everything had been lies." She paused in the interview, choosing her next words carefully. "When they did not touch us, when they looked away, when they maintained their distance. At first, I thought it was contempt. Then I thought it was fear. Finally, I understood. It was respect. They respected the rules more than their desires. They respected us as prisoners more than they resented us as enemies. I had never encountered anything like it." The American treatment of German female POWs illustrated a principle that transcends military history. Institutions that enforce ethical conduct consistently can shape individual behavior profoundly. The guards at Camp Florence were not saints. They were ordinary soldiers, many barely 20 years old, far from home, dealing with enemy prisoners in a desert camp. They had the same impulses, the same capacity for cruelty or exploitation as any other humans in similar circumstances. What made them different was not individual virtue but institutional accountability. They knew that misconduct would be punished. They knew that officers conducted inspections, that prisoners could file complaints, that the military justice system took prisoner treatment seriously. This knowledge shaped behavior in ways personal morality alone might not have. For the German women, encountering this system was transformative. They had been raised in a society where institutional discipline often served brutal ends, where orders were followed without moral consideration, where the machinery of state power was directed toward genocide and conquest. Encountering an institutional framework designed to protect rather than exploit prisoners forced them to reconsider their understanding of power, authority, and national character. The irony was profound. The very professionalism the American Guards displayed, their detachment, their by-the-book conduct, their refusal to engage personally, became proof of a kind of civilization the propaganda had insisted Americans lacked. The Guards' boredom, their routine, their obvious desire to be anywhere else, all testified to a system that constrained individual impulse in service of broader principles. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the American Guards' conduct was what they did not do. They did not boast. They did not exploit their power. They did not demand gratitude or acknowledgement. They simply performed their duties according to regulations, treated prisoners with detached professionalism, and counted days until discharge. This absence of exploitation was itself revolutionary. The German women had been conditioned to expect that men with power over women would use that power. When the Americans consistently failed to do so, when they maintained their distance shift after shift, week after week, month after month, it shattered assumptions about human nature and authority. The Guards' very ordinariness became their most powerful argument. They were not crusaders or moralists. They were bored soldiers following orders, doing their jobs, waiting to go home. And precisely that ordinariness, the fact that decent treatment of prisoners was simply standard operating procedure, nothing special, nothing worth remarking upon, made the most compelling case for the values the American system represented. Captain Morrison noted in his final report, submitted when Camp Florence closed in March 1946, female prisoner repatriation completed without incident. Guards maintained professional conduct throughout. No disciplinary actions required. Recommend dissolution of facility. The bureaucratic language concealed the human transformation that had occurred within those fences. 43 women had entered believing they understood the world and their place in it. They left knowing they had been wrong, that the propaganda had been lies, that the enemy had been more humane than their own leadership. Some carried that knowledge with relief, others with guilt. All carried it with a sense of disorientation that would take years to process. The story of German female POWs in American custody is not about heroism. It is about systems, about institutional frameworks that constrained human impulses and enforced ethical conduct, about the power of consistent, boring professionalism to achieve moral outcomes that exhortations to virtue often cannot. The American guards at Camp Florence were not better men than their German counterparts. They were men operating within better systems, systems that established clear rules, enforced those rules consistently, and punished violations seriously. The institutional framework did the moral work that individual conscience might have failed to accomplish. For the German women who experienced this system, the lesson was transformative. They learned that civilization is not about grand gestures, but about mundane discipline. That barbarism is prevented not through moral superiority, but through institutional accountability. That the measure of a society is how it treats the powerless, particularly when no one is watching. The guards who looked away, who maintained their distance, who treated enemy women prisoners with detached professionalism, they defeated Nazi propaganda more effectively than any battlefield victory could have. They proved, through sustained routine behavior, that the racial theories and cultural supremacy claims the Third Reich had promoted were lies. They demonstrated that Americans, whom Nazi propaganda had portrayed as mongrel barbarians, were capable of restraint and decency even toward enemies. Decades later, when historians examined the reintegration of German society into the democratic West, they identified many factors: Marshall Plan aid, Cold War pressure, leadership by reformers like Adenauer. But underneath these major forces ran quieter currents, the accumulated experiences of German citizens who had encountered Allied forces and found them different than expected. POWs who returned home with stories of adequate food and fair treatment, women prisoners who had braced for assault and instead received professional courtesy. These individual experiences, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of prisoners, became a foundation for post-war reconciliation. They could not erase the crimes of the Nazi regime. They could not resurrect the dead or rebuild destroyed cities. But they could and did provide evidence that the Allied nations practiced values different from those the Wehrmacht had represented. That difference mattered. The last truck carrying German women away from Camp Florence passed through the gate on a February morning, when the desert air was cool and clear. The sun had just cleared the mountains to the east, casting long shadows across the compound. Guard towers stood empty. The barracks waited for demolition. Within months, the camp would be gone, recycled into America's peacetime economy, the land returned to desert scrub. But the memory of what had not happened there, the assaults that never occurred, the exploitation that never materialized, the fear that proved unfounded, that memory traveled east with 43 women returning to a broken country. They carried it through occupation zones and refugee camps, through years of rebuilding and slow recovery, through the long process of understanding how thoroughly they had been deceived. Some spoke of their experiences openly. Others kept silent, processing privately what it meant to have been wrong about everything. A few wrote memoirs in later years, documenting their time as prisoners and the cognitive dissonance of encountering decent treatment from a supposed enemy. Greta Weber's account, published in 1986, concluded with a passage that captured the essential paradox. We feared them because we had been told they were monsters. They ignored us because we were prisoners and they had rules. In that gap between our expectations and their behavior, something broke inside us, not violently but completely. The propaganda we had believed our entire adult lives simply dissolved. We had served a regime built on lies, and meeting people who told the truth, even without words, just through their conduct, made that undeniable. The guards at Camp Florence never knew the impact they had. They had simply done their jobs, followed their orders, and gone home when the war ended. They had not been trying to prove anything or change anyone's mind. They had just been soldiers counting days, following regulations, maintaining the discipline their officers demanded. And in doing so, they had accomplished what no propaganda campaign could have. They had demonstrated through boring routine professionalism that institutions could enforce decency, that power did not have to corrupt, that enemies could be treated as human beings rather than spoils of war. It was not heroic, it was barely noteworthy, but it was revolutionary nonetheless. The desert sun climbed higher, the dust settled on empty barracks, And somewhere in Germany, women who had expected the worst of human nature found themselves remembering men who had simply followed the rules, who had looked away, who had treated them not as women or enemies but as prisoners under their care. That memory, multiplied across thousands of similar encounters, became one of the quiet forces that helped build a different post-war world. Not through grand gestures, not through moral crusading, just through sustained institutional insistence that there were lines that would not be crossed, even in war, even with enemies, even when no one was watching. The guards looked away, and in that simple act of professional distance, they proved more about American values than any propaganda could have claimed. The sun climbed higher over Camp Florence, illuminating empty space where transformation had occurred, where fear had dissolved, where women had learned that everything they had been told was wrong. The heat shimmered, the dust settled. The desert waited, patient and indifferent, as it always had, and the story carried in memory across an ocean became part of the larger truth about what had happened in those years, about systems and institutions, about rules and discipline, about the quiet power of doing the right thing, simply because regulations required it. The war had ended. The prisoners had gone home. But the lesson remained. Civilization is not about perfection. It is about systems that constrain imperfection, institutions that enforce decency, rules that prevent barbarism even when barbarism would be easy. Camp Florence closed in March 1946. By summer, no trace remained except survey markers and disturbed earth. The women who had passed through carried the only lasting monument, the memory of men who had looked away, who had kept their distance, who had treated enemies as human beings deserving basic dignity. It was enough, more than enough. It changed everything.